Today, we are going through the roller coaster of emotions players might have felt, as during the announcements for the news related to 11.1, the next season of this expansion, one of the things players might have read as they skimmed through all of the details, particularly the balance tuning ones, the planned changes for each of the specs, was going down to the part about Augmentation Evoker and reading the point that said Ebon Might, so the long since controversial primary stat buff of the Augmentation Evoker, no longer affects tanks and healers. Instead, now it just goes to DPS specs. Blizzard is pointing out exactly what many players have often said about the power of this effect when it comes to tanks and healers. They were saying Augmentation Evoker has boosted group survivability too much, especially in smaller group content compared to other specializations due to Ebon Might affecting tanks and healers. So obviously giving more primary stat to a tank means they can do more damage. They can have a higher value to some of their defensives, like Ignore Pain, for example, or other abilities scaling with your primary stat. Of course, for healers, giving more primary stat means they get to heal for more. So their logic is, now that we get rid of Ebon Might affecting tanks and healers, it will be easier to balance Augmentation Evoker. Now, what many players assumed, of course, is that after reading that, well, Augmentation Evoker has been giga nerfed, one of their niche, one of their specialties from Mythic Plus, giving more power to the tank and the healer. As you know by now, many of the hurdles of high-level Mythic Plus is not really to do enough DPS to make the time, trying to get there by the last second, trying to squeeze as much damage as you can. It is rather how high do you have to go before you start getting one shot and it's impossible to clear a key because of the damage you are taking. So obviously in that kind of meta, being able to be more defensive and being able to just survive to make it to the end of a key is a very powerful tool. Just look, for example, at some of the highest, top level keys being completed right now. You have, Arakaras being completed 4.5 minutes before the end of the timer. 4 minutes for Necrotic Quake as well. We can search for different level keys. Maybe Dawn, it's 1 minute 20. You have 1 minute 20 for Arakara. Dawn again, it's 1 minute. A lot of these skills, even top level keys, are well within being able to finish in time. The bigger problem is trying to stay alive as you complete that key, which means, of course, the use of an Augmentation Evoker becomes very, very powerful. So that's it now. With Augmentation Evoker being nerfed, it is now over. It will now be treated as just another DPS spec. So either you do top damage, either we go week by week, we check, as usual, we go and check the DPS rankings, and if Augmentation Evoker isn't doing some top damage like some of these specs, then we can expect them not to be meta in Mythic Plus. However, where things get turned somewhat upside down is that, of course, this comes with a compensation. Unlike Blizzard getting rid of Ancestral Guidance for Shamans without giving them healing compensation for what they lost, they actually do that for Augmentation Evokers, because what they do is they bring back Close as Clutchmates. So the passive that gave you more value to your Ebon Might and your Breath of Eons outside of a raid. So now Ebon Might and Breath of Eons are back to being 25% more powerful outside of a raid. What this does is practically you are taking away 5% primary stat from the tank, 5% primary stat from the healer, but you are giving 1.5% more primary stat to all three of the DPS. So you are losing 10% primary stat and you are gaining 4.5% primary stat, but the gain is to the DPS and the loss is to the tank and the healer. On top of this, the 25% stronger Breath of Eons will gain more value, of course, because now the DPS get to do more damage, meaning they get to pump more value into Breath of Eons. Now this, together with the extra new talent Rockfall to give you faster cast time for your upheaval, as well as more Essence Burst generation, as well as the buff given to Modes of Possibility, it's gonna be a very slight damage buff to Augmentation Evoker. So in general, you gain slightly more damage than you did before, but now you no longer buff the healer and the tank. So what's the result of this? Well, the result of this is that Augmentation Evoker still maintains quite a few of its utility anyway, including other evoker things like Zephyr, for example, or rescue. They still have access to blistering scales to give to the tank. They still have the value of their mastery, which still gives versatility, which can still give you damage reduction. Even though Ebon Might can no longer go on healers and tanks, this mastery can still go on your tank and on your healer. The point of losing primary stat, over time, Evoker has lost a lot of its value when it comes to defensiveness. Now, even now in the current meta builds of Evoker, one of their strongest tools for defensive power has gotten nerfed so much that you don't even use it anymore. Draconic Attunements, what gave you the passive health increase to basically your entire party, used to be, back in the day, if we go to the changelog, used to be released at a 5% base HP increase just to all of your party, basically a fortitude buff to all the party. And then when you actually did use your defensive, your obsidian scales, you used to increase this buff up to a 13% health increase, which was a very, very good buff because you had 2 charges of obsidian scales on a 90-second cooldown, so it had an even higher uptime than something like Rallying Cry, for example. But since then, the base HP went from 5 to 2%, and the active extra HP went from 13 to 4%. So it was nerfed practically by over 3 times as much as it used to be in the beginning, and it started as a result not even being used to begin with. As mentioned, the 2 other tools for defensiveness that you still have are still there: your versatility from the mastery and your blistering scales from your armor to give to the tank, as well as the evoker extra tools like Zephyr and like Rescue are all still there. What you're losing is just the primary stat, the tank and healer, which is not really enough to weaken Augmentation Evoker, especially if then you also offset this by having more powerful burst and more powerful damage to give out to your DPS in your Mythic Plus group. Now, this has been quite effectively offset in the raid. Back in Season 2, when Evoker launched, Evoker straight up shot up to the rankings of the most played of the roles in the raid. As you went through Season 3 of Dragonflight, the first season where Augmentation was available from week 1, so from the release of the raid, Augmentation remained one of the most played of the specs throughout the entirety of the raid. And then you entered this season, Nerobar Palace, where we did see, after the list of nerfs given to Augmentation, we did effectively see the weakening of the power of Augmentation. Now they went on to be a middling spec when it comes to their raid value compared to what we got in the second part of Dragonfly. So at least when it comes to the raid participation, it was a reasonable success. The raining down of the power of Augmentation, or rather the mandatory spots, plural, even more than 1 spots in the raid that you wanted to give Augmentation. Where things got a little bit more complicated was of course in Mythic Plus, because ever since the introduction of Augmentation, they shot up incredibly high in their value. They were dominating Season 2, even for the first 3 months of Season 3, which was the Dragonflight season where Evoker ate something like 27 different nerfs. Nerf after nerf after nerf, they still kept on being super played for the first half of the entire season. They lost out in the second part of the season, only to then be brought up in the last season of Dragonflight and then begin again this new expansion, as popular as they had been since their release. This is quite the unique thing at the moment. If you look at the level of diversity of specs in Mythic Plus, the Gini coefficient score, where the closer you are to 1000, the worse you are in terms of variety. The only other times we used to have worse situations than when Augmentation has been introduced in Mythic Plus were only a handful of times. One time was in Season 3 and Season 4 of Shadowlands with the combo of survival and destruction. As you can see from the score, we are in the high 700 score when it comes to that combination of specs. And the other one was the Season 2 of BFA with Outlaw. Outlaw almost single-handedly dictating the popularity of the specs in Mythic Plus, so much so that most of the top picks for comps in Mythic Plus back then were basically double Outlaw comps. Those were the only 2 other times in practically 8 years, from Legion to Shadowlands to BFA to Dragonflight and like 15 seasons of Mythic Plus, where this kind of oppressive popularity of a certain spec happened in Mythic Plus. Whereas ever since Augmentation was introduced, we practically had this happen every season. It is definitely still a good choice to move away from buffing the tank and and the healer, especially in Mythic Plus, not to give an unfair advantage over other DPS specs. However, even after removing this primary stat buff, we still end up having with likely Augmentation Evoker still delivering a few too many things, a few too many features in your party to sort of get rid of. Especially now that they can concentrate all of their damage buffs practically just on the DPS specs. So more primary stat on the DPS because of Ebon Might, more burst damage to the other DPS specs because now Breath of Eons will be even stronger, specifically for DPS specs. But at least now we are moving closer and closer to the spec itself being more and more of a pure DPS spec and less so about a buff bot that really unbalanced thing when it came to the advantage you got by buffing the A-Tank and the healer in a meta of Mythic Plus where it was more important to stay alive. Therefore, the more you were able to buff the tank and the healer, the more advantages you got over other DPS specs. So the entire point of this video is just a PSA to point out that yes, even though the nerf looks massive at first glance, because just losing what you thought was very important for an evoker in terms of buffs, losing the ability to buff the tank and healer looks like a major nerf, actually it's not nearly as big as it looks. In fact, it's a net neutral change, it's a slight positive buff if you include the other changes planned for 11.1. You're actually not going to be losing any damage. If anything, you are going to be gaining some damage more compared to what you have now at the cost of the main primary stat increase to your tank and your healer. We will see if this will be enough to knock Augmentation out of their mandatory spot in Mythic Plus right now when it comes to high level keys, but at the moment the odds are not that likely for now. It is still good that we are moving in this direction, but for now it doesn't seem like it will be quite enough. So we will of course see the development of 11.1, possibly any more tuning going through for this spec and many others, but for today on this Thursday it is all we have to go over when it comes to the changes for 11.1. So we can leave each other for today by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, at this rate, it's gonna be 2027 when Augmentation will finally no longer be a mandatory pick. You know, slow and steady.